Martin McGuinness, I think responsible for more deaths than anybody else in the UK in recent decades, died and was eulogised in the House of Commons. 24 hours later, the House of Commons was attacked by another type of terrorism. But I think this is a very bad sign for this country. The way in which we treat terrorists of the past tells us how we will treat terrorists of the future.
So let me tell you, for myself, and I can speak on behalf of perhaps 99% of the British Muslim public, that generally none of us know the motives behind people who carry out these acts. I myself am very much part of this society. I'm born and raised a Londoner. I'm an observant Muslim, and you don't see somebody like me carrying out these acts inspired by my faith. Therefore, I'm not saying, and people are analysing scripture. It's not whether it's the Quran or the biblical scripture. You seem to be quite hung up on the fact that this is a Quranic scriptural point.
Scriptures are open to interpretation, but literally, if they're not quoting scripture.
Miss Lucy thinks that none of the terrorists ever quote the Quran. Flat out wrong. I mean, who on earth thought it would? I mean, who thought that a guy with a knife in a car was going to bring down British democracy and cause the Queen to abdicate and put the flag of Islam over Buckingham Palace? I mean, really, proselytization begins, okay? Let me just finish my point. That would seem to me to be, therefore, a very clear occasion, never mind the thousands of others we could list worldwide, a very clear occasion on this country when one of our soldiers was murdered on our streets, where clearly scripture had something to do with it. So the problem that a lot of us have is we are willing to discuss the drugs bit, we're willing to discuss the foreign policy bit, we're willing to discuss all this. Why are you not willing to concede that there is a religious element sometimes?
In this debate, Douglas Murray silenced the Muslim girl with his logical arguments. Murray argues that some terrorists actually use Quranic verses to justify their actions. His point is that although not all Muslims subscribe to these interpretations, it is important to acknowledge that certain individuals and groups use religious texts as part of to justify violence.
Well, the reason why people assumed that he was doing this, at least was inspired by Islamic State, is because it's something that Islamic State has called upon people around the world to do, using exactly this sort of methodology. Islamic State has said for some years that since various cells in the West have found it very hard to get hold of the technology to make bombs in recent years, they've been disrupted from doing so. Since it's very hard in the UK, for instance, to get hold of Kalashnikov rifles, ISIS has called on people in countries like this who follow their message to carry out attacks using vehicles, very low-grade attacks, knives, you know, this sort of thing. So that's why it fits a pattern of ISIS-inspired attacks. So we'll find out exactly, or some more of what motivated him in the days and weeks and months to come.
Douglas Murray addresses worrying signs regarding ISIS, inspired attacks and the glorification of past terrorists. ISIS has sought to inspire individuals and groups around the world to carry out attacks in its name. These attacks are often characterized by brutality and are intended to instill fear and attract media attention. The ability is to radicalize individuals through online propaganda and social media is a significant concern. This allowed the organization to influence and direct attacks from afar, even after losing territorial control in the Middle East.
As for the question of publicity, this is a huge question which we're always wondering about. This was a good week, after all, wasn't it, to wonder about terrorism and our attitude towards it in general. Martin McGuinness, I think responsible for more deaths than anybody else in the UK in recent decades, died and was eulogised in the House of Commons. 24 hours later, the House of Commons was attacked by another type of terrorism. But I think this is a very bad sign for this country. The way in which we treat terrorists of the past tells us how we will treat terrorists of the future. But this I think should really worry us. During the IRA's campaign, people said we would never give in to terror. All MPs, policemen and others all said the same thing again this week. But the record shows in this country that we can give in to terror and have. And so, you know, the whole issue of media coverage, by comparison with that fundamental societal problem, is relatively easy to solve.
Douglas Murray has actually expressed concern about the eulogization of past terrorists, such as Martin McGuinness, seeing it as a worrying sign for the future. Murray argues that eulogizing figures like McGuinness risks normalizing their violence. It sends a message that terrorism can be forgiven or overlooked if one takes on a political role later on. Glorifying past terrorists could set a dangerous precedent, potentially inspiring future generations to see violence as a legitimate means to achieve political ends.
A view as somebody who does work in the media and is obviously clearly and evidently observant Muslim, and I'm part of both worlds.
What do you think about the tone of the coverage?
It's really important, and as a role as a journalist, that you do your job and you do it well. So that goes back to the accuracy. That there was misinformation pledged out this week, and the problem is social media is so quick. So where certain outlets and networks have taken their time to fact check and get the accuracy, and they've delivered to the public that news. That is our duty first and foremost as journalists, to do a job and do it well. The problem is, and it's across all sectors, so that's broadcast, print, digital, online, we abide by editorial guidelines, and it's so important because when we don't, it undermines our credibility and the work that we do. And it really does, and it's a mockery of the job that we do. And our job is to serve the public, and our job is to give the correct information.
Muslim Girl emphasized in the pursuit of truth, mistakes can sometimes occur. We need to focus more on the broader story and the impact of our stories, she points out. Journalists must adhere to strict editorial guidelines to maintain integrity. These guidelines often include verifying sources, cross-checking facts, and avoiding sensationalism. Adherence to editorial standards is a professional responsibility that distinguishes trustworthy journalism from misinformation or propaganda.
I think it's been very, very...
Has it been happening?
I think it's been very... What about the EDL for? I mean, I'm talking about our society as a whole, okay? In our society as a whole, and our media as a whole, there has not been any crazy response to this. The media, by and large, has done its job. It's been fairly restrained. I agree that there is a time, definitely, for all of the discussions that have come up already. But by the way, quickly on this thing about motive, and I think we shouldn't attribute motive until we know. But we should certainly look into the cases where drugs have been involved. I think it's long overdue to consider that. I also think we're long overdue to consider the role that religion can play in these attacks as well. These are not mutually exclusive. You know, there are many people who have carried out Islamist attacks who have been, eating pork, drinking and so on, and then do what they do precisely as an act of, as it were, religious purification. That's very common. So these things are not, the 9/11 hijackers went to strip bars and all that kind of thing. These things are not exclusive. They're a very, very complex picture that leads somebody to carry out this sort of thing. But we should be having a wide-ranging discussion on it. Thankfully on this programme we can, but quite often in our media and elsewhere we don't have as wide-ranging a discussion as we should, and our politicians in particular are clearly terrified of aspects of this discussion. Well, first of all, they're scared of saying, actually, the amount of people proclaiming this week, we will not allow this to change our society. I mean, who on earth thought it would? I mean, who thought that a guy with a knife in a car was going to bring down British democracy and cause the Queen to abdicate and put the flag of Islam over Buckingham Palace? I mean, really.
Douglas Murray's reaction can be seen, while the wider story is important. The foundation of journalism lies in its commitment to accuracy and fact-checking.
Politicians and the media are reluctant to address the complexity of Islamophobic far-right organizations and the significant proportion of global attacks instigated by extremists motivated by radical Islam. While it cannot be denied that radical Islamic ideologies have played a significant role in many terrorist attacks, it would be too simplistic to assume that these actions are solely related to religion. At the same time, Murray also argues for the role of religion and drugs in terrorist attacks, and argues that they are not mutually exclusive factors.
So let me tell you, for myself, and I can speak on behalf of perhaps 99% of the British Muslim public, that generally none of us know the motives behind people who carry out these acts. I myself am very much part of this society. I'm born and raised a Londoner. I'm an observant Muslim, and you don't see somebody like me carrying out these acts inspired by my faith. Therefore, I'm not saying, and people are analysing scripture. It's not whether it's the Quran or the biblical scripture. I mean, you seem to be quite hung up on the fact that this is a Quranic scriptural point.
Scriptures are open to interpretation, and literalists cannot quote scripture.
British Muslim girl insists that terrorists are not motivated by the Quran. They are driven by political and social issues.
Miss and Lucy thinks that none of the terrorists ever quote the Quran. Flat out wrong. Flat out wrong. Let me give you one example. You mentioned it earlier, the killers of Lee Rigby. Michael Adelajo, on his body, when the police arrested him, he had a note in his pocket to his young daughter explaining why he did what he did. It's all on the public record. You can see the facsimile on the BBC's website, and he has footnotes throughout it of Quranic verses that he explains justify, in his view, his actions. Now, that's the beginning. Let me just finish my point. That would seem to me to be, therefore, a very clear occasion, never mind the thousands of others we could list worldwide, a very clear occasion on this country when one of our soldiers was murdered on our streets, where clearly scripture had something to do with it. So the problem that a lot of us have is we are willing to discuss the drugs bit, we're willing to discuss the foreign policy bit, we're willing to discuss all this. Why are you not willing to concede that there is a religious element sometimes?
Douglas Murray often criticizes media coverage and society's response to terrorism, emphasizing the importance of accuracy and context in reporting. Murray emphasized that accurate and responsible reporting is essential to maintaining public trust in the media. Sensational or misleading news coverage can exacerbate fears and contribute to public misperceptions.
Arguably an attack by which the US have said it was them, and it hasn't had the same coverage everyone says. But there's a reason it hasn't had the same coverage, just because there isn't the same appetite for that coverage. It's still there for people who are interested, who want to look at it, see what's happened.
So it's a commercial consideration.
It's a commercial consideration.
Very quickly, we have to come to the end.
Obviously, 24-hour news pushes a lot of this. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation because we have the 24-hour news culture. However, there are things about that that are unhealthy, but it's nothing like as unhealthy as the fact that if you look back, as I said at the start, about our attitude to terror of the past and our attitude to terror present, when the IRA killed MPs and many policemen and many soldiers, what did we end up doing? We ended up putting the people who had orchestrated that campaign at the heart of government, and that is far sicker. The idea that 20 years from now, anyone who was associated with Saddam Hussein would be put into power, that's far more of a societal sickness than 24-hour news media.
Saba, I'm going to give you the last word, Saba. We've got another debate coming with very interesting people to talk about it, and it's a fascinating topic.
It's a double-edged sword. I think overall it's been quite responsible. However, there have been some tabloids and some news that has gone on, as we all are aware, that has been misinformation, and things such as, Birmingham is the jihadist capital of England, that's not helpful unless it's backed up by evidence.
It is.
And
it's actually not the capital, it's the second capital of terror.
London is the capital.
London is the capital of terror, in the UK, Birmingham is second.
Debatable.
No. If you look at the stats released earlier this month, it proves that.
Murray asserts the claim that Birmingham is a jihadi capital is a clear example of misinformation. This false narrative was notably propagated by a Fox News commentator in 2015, who falsely claimed that Birmingham was fully Muslim and banned non-Muslims. Such statements contribute to harmful stereotypes and can cause xenophobia and distrust. They also undermine the credibility of the media outlet that disseminates them. Douglas Murray uses statistics to argue against the link between terrorism and Islamic texts. Murray will reference data from reliable sources such as the Global Terrorism Database to show the incidence of terrorist attacks worldwide and their motives. In short, while it is important to address the problem of terrorism, reducing it solely to Islamic texts is an oversimplification. Statistical evidence emphasizes that terrorism is a multifaceted problem, influenced by many factors. The vast majority of Muslims do not interpret their religious texts as promoting violence, and many actively work against extremism.